It was on one of those rare evenings when Baker Street lay in an unusual hush, save for the occasional clip-clop of hansom cabs below, that Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair, eyes half closed, the smoke from his pipe curling lazily toward the ceiling. I, for my part, had been perusing the morning's newspaper, though my attention waned. My friend had not spoken for nearly an hour, save for the occasional murmur of thought that signalled the workings of that singular mind. "Watson," he said at last, breaking the silence, "do you recall the most inexplicable case we have yet encountered?" I laid aside the paper. "You have posed a difficult question, Holmes. I should say the affair of the Musgrave ritual was among the most confounding." Holmes smiled faintly. "A well-constructed puzzle, yes, but it had its solution within the bounds of human reasoning. There exist, however, cases which, to the untrained observer, appear almost to defy logic itself." Before I could inquire further, our conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps upon the stair. It was the firm, deliberate tread of a man with purpose, yet there was hesitation in its rhythm, as though the visitor approached our door with an uncertainty of mind. Holmes glanced at me with amusement. "We are about to be presented with just such a case, Watson," he said, reaching for his pipe. "One, I suspect, that will demand all the powers of observation at our disposal." A moment later, Mrs. Hudson rapped at the door and entered, her face composed, but her eyes holding a flicker of curiosity. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes, a Mr. Reginald Harrow." Holmes sat forward. "Show him in." The man who entered was well dressed, his attire that of a banker or a man accustomed to handling great sums of money. His overcoat was of fine quality, yet he clutched it tightly about him, as though the warmth of our sitting room had failed to reach him. He was in his mid-40s, with dark hair receding at the temples, and a face that might have been handsome were it not for the deep lines of worry etched upon his brow. He hesitated upon the threshold, his keen eyes darting about the room before settling upon Holmes, who regarded him with an expression of detached curiosity. "You must be Mr. Holmes," he said at last, his voice low but firm. Holmes inclined his head. "And this is my colleague, Dr. Watson. Pray, take a seat. You seem troubled, Mr. Harrow. I gather that you have been wrestling with some perplexing difficulty for several weeks at least." Harrow started slightly. How did you know that?" Holmes waved a hand. "The cuffs of your sleeves betray you. They are worn at the edges, yet your coat is new. A man of your profession does not neglect such details unless his mind is wholly occupied elsewhere." Harrow exhaled as though conceding defeat before the match had begun. "Mr. Holmes, I have come to you because I fear I am losing my mind." Watson and I exchanged glances. Holmes merely leaned forward, his expression sharpening. "Then let us hope," he said, "that logic may yet prevail over madness." Harrow reached into his pocket, hesitated, then withdrew a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. He placed it carefully upon the table between us and unwrapped it with deliberate precision. The golden surface caught the dim lamplight, gleaming with an almost unnatural lustre. "It is because of this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A coin, a simple sovereign, and yet it is not simple at all." Holmes regarded the coin with interest, though he made no immediate move to touch it. He merely observed, as a naturalist might examine an unfamiliar specimen. "A sovereign," he murmured. "And what of it, Mr. Harrow?" Harrow wet his lips. "I first received it 5 years ago, quite by accident. It came into my possession through an estate matter at the bank where I'm employed. It was of no great consequence to me then. I spent it, I believe, on a cab fare." "And yet, here it is before us," Holmes observed. "Precisely." Harrow's voice rose slightly. "The very same sovereign. It found its way back to me days later, in change from a tobacconist's. I thought it an odd coincidence and gave it little more thought. But then it happened again. And again. I would pay for a meal, only to find it among my earnings a week later. I wagered it in a game of whist, only to discover it in my coat pocket the next morning. It returns to me, Mr. Holmes, no matter how many times I part with it." Watson, who had been listening intently, let out a quiet chuckle. "Surely, sir, this is nothing more than happenstance. A man handles dozens of sovereigns in his daily transactions. What proof have you that this is the same coin?" Harrow turned to him. "Examine the surface, Doctor. You will see a small imperfection, a minute scratch beneath the profile of Her Majesty." Holmes took up his magnifying glass and held it over the coin. "Indeed," he murmured. "The mark is distinct." He turned the coin over, studying the reverse side. "Curious. And have you made any effort to rid yourself of it through more decisive means?" Harrow's mouth set in a grim line. "I have thrown it into the Thames." Watson raised an eyebrow. "I have left it on a train. I have given it to beggars in the street. And each time, within a few days, it finds its way back to me." He exhaled slowly, his hands clenched together. "Mr. Holmes, I am not a superstitious man, but this, I can find no rational explanation. I do not believe in ghosts, nor curses, nor fate. And yet this coin defies me. I cannot be rid of it." Holmes set down the glass and regarded him intently. "Tell me, Mr. Harrow, before this sovereign came into your possession, to whom did it belong?" Harrow hesitated. "It was part of the estate of a man named Elias Thornton. He was a client of our bank before his sudden death, 5 years ago." Holmes steepled his fingers, his gaze growing distant. "Elias Thornton," he repeated. "A name not unfamiliar to me. Yes. I believe this mystery is less supernatural than it appears, but undoubtedly most fascinating." Watson glanced at Holmes, noting the keen glimmer in his eyes. The game, it seemed, was afoot. For a moment there was silence in our sitting room, broken only by the steady ticking of the mantel clock. Mr. Reginald Harrow sat rigid in his chair, his hands tightly clasped as if they might steady the turmoil within him. Holmes, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, regarded him with the sharp, unwavering scrutiny of a man who had encountered many minds unravelling before him. "I have considered every rational explanation, Mr. Holmes," Harrow said at last, his voice tinged with frustration. "And yet, none will suffice. There are times when I wake in the night, convinced that I shall find the coin waiting for me upon my bedside table. When I reach into my pocket, it is there. Even when I am certain I placed it elsewhere, I cannot escape it." Holmes tapped his fingers against the armrest. "And you believe, then, that you are the victim of forces beyond human understanding?" Harrow hesitated, his expression torn between reason and dread. "I do not wish to believe it, sir. But what other conclusion remains? Either I am the subject of some elaborate trickery, or—" He stopped himself, shaking his head. Watson leaned forward. "Or what, sir?" Harrow exhaled sharply. "Or I am cursed." Holmes emitted a quiet but unmistakable chuckle. "Come, Mr. Harrow, let us not descend into the realm of fairy tales. You are not the first man to find himself entangled in an enigma of possession. The laws of probability are often mistaken for the work of unseen hands." Harrow's jaw tightened. "Then you do not believe me?" "On the contrary," said Holmes, rising from his chair. "I find your account altogether too remarkable to dismiss." He turned his keen gaze upon the sovereign once more. "But rest assured, sir, whatever forces are at play, they are human in origin, and it is human agency that we shall uncover." Harrow exhaled in visible relief. "Then you will take the case?" Holmes reached for his magnifying glass. "That, Mr. Harrow, is precisely what I intend to do." With great care, Holmes lifted the sovereign between his fingers, holding it beneath the glow of the lamplight. He turned it over, his sharp eyes drinking in every minute detail. "Watson, what do you observe?" he asked, offering the coin to me. I took it in my palm, examining its surface. "It appears to be an ordinary sovereign, save for the scratch beneath Her Majesty's profile. That, I assume, is what Mr. Harrow believes marks it as. His Holmes nodded. A small but distinct blemish, and yet I suspect this coin is far from ordinary. He retrieved his magnifying glass and studied the edges. Curious, do you note the faint markings along the rim? I peered closer. They appear to be no more than the natural wear of an aged coin. Perhaps, Holmes murmured, or perhaps something more deliberate. Mr. Harrow, I presume you have not had this coin examined by an expert in numismatics. Harrow shook his head. No, sir. I have been too preoccupied with its infernal return. Then that is where we must begin, Holmes declared. He placed the coin upon the table, his expression one of keen satisfaction. Your case presents a most intriguing challenge, Mr. Harrow. You speak of the sovereign as though it possesses a will of its own, but that is, of course, impossible. Things do not act upon their own accord. They are acted upon. Harrow leaned forward. Then you believe someone is doing this to me deliberately? Holmes smiled faintly. The world, Mr. Harrow, is full of unseen hands moving in calculated ways. What remains to be determined is whose hands, and to what end. He reached for his coat and hat. Watson, you will accompany me to the city in the morning. Mr. Harrow, I shall require the names of every person who has come into contact with this sovereign since it first fell into your possession. Harrow nodded. I will provide what I can. Holmes turned to me with that familiar glimmer of energy in his eyes. Come, Watson, we have much to uncover, and I do believe this case shall prove most illuminating. The following morning, Holmes and I set out for the heart of the city, where the great financial institutions of London stood in their imposing grandeur. The offices of Harrow and Sons, a well-respected banking house, were located on Lombard Street, a place where vast fortunes were made and lost with little more than the stroke of a pen. Harrow himself greeted us at the entrance, the tension in his face undiminished despite Holmes's assurances of logical explanation. He led us through the marble-floored corridors, past rows of clerks bent diligently over their ledgers, until we reached his private office, a dark panelled room lined with leather-bound volumes and locked cabinets. I have instructed my clerks to provide any records you may require, Harrow said, motioning us to sit. Though I confess, I have examined the matter myself many times over and found nothing amiss. Holmes settled into his chair, his sharp gaze sweeping over the room before coming to rest upon Harrow. Let us begin at the source, he said. You first took possession of this sovereign 5 years ago. Under what circumstances? Harrow opened a ledger and ran his finger down the page. It was part of an estate transfer. The client in question was Elias Thornton, an elderly gentleman who held an account with us for several years. Holmes leaned forward. And this Thornton, did he leave any heirs? Harrow shook his head. None that ever came forward. His estate was modest, consisting mainly of a few financial holdings and personal effects. The sovereign was among them. It was recorded, processed, and ultimately transferred to my personal assets due to a clerical oversight. Holmes's fingers drummed against the armrest. An oversight indeed, and you are certain the coin itself was unremarkable at the time? As certain as one can be, Harrow replied. It was merely another entry in a long list of transactions. I had no reason to think of it again, until it refused to leave my possession. Holmes exchanged a glance with me before rising. I should like to examine Mr. Thornton's estate records in detail, and then, Mr. Harrow, we must pay a visit to his former residence. It did not take long for Holmes to peruse the bank's records, his keen eyes darting over the faded ink of ledgers and account statements with the precision of a man reconstructing a crime from the faintest of clues. The name Elias Thornton appeared with surprising regularity. Small deposits made at odd intervals, withdrawn again with equal unpredictability. This man did not manage his funds in a conventional manner, Holmes mused, tapping a long finger against the page. There is no discernible pattern, no investments or interest gained. It is as though he simply needed a place to store his wealth temporarily. Harrow nodded. He was a reclusive man, rarely seen outside his home in Kensington. My clerks recall little of him, save that he was always punctual in his dealings and spoke very little. Holmes closed the ledger and handed it back. And his death? A sudden heart failure. He was found in his study by a housekeeper. Was there anything peculiar about the scene? Harrow hesitated. Nothing that I was ever made aware of, but I recall hearing that he had a reputation for eccentricity. He was known to collect rare coins. Perhaps this sovereign was among them. Holmes's expression sharpened. A collector, you say? That changes matters considerably. I had known Holmes long enough to recognize the flicker of excitement in his eyes. The faint but unmistakable glimmer that signified the chase was truly beginning. "Come, Watson," he said, rising swiftly. "We must see this house for ourselves. I have a suspicion that Mr. Elias Thornton has not yet finished speaking to us." Holmes remained deep in thought as we rode back through the crowded streets of London, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm against the armrest of our cab. When we reached Baker Street, he withdrew the bank's ledger from his pocket and examined it once more, his keen eyes scrutinizing every figure, every notation. "Watson," he said at length, "observe this entry dated 5 years ago. Elias Thornton's account was closed upon his death, his assets distributed accordingly, and yet you see here," he pointed to a line beneath the final transaction, "an anomaly, a transfer recorded in faint ink, almost an afterthought." I leaned closer. "Yes, I see it. The sovereign in question, assigned not to an heir, but directly to Harrow's personal assets." "Precisely," Holmes murmured. "Now why should that be?" We sat in silence for a moment before he continued. "A clerical mistake," Harrow called it. "And yet, there is something altogether too convenient in such an error. It is not the sum of money that interests me, Watson, but rather the nature of the object itself. Thornton, a collector of rare coins, would not have idly left behind a piece of no significance. If the sovereign was among his effects, it was because he valued it. And if he valued it, there must be a reason why." "Do you suspect Harrow of deception?" I asked. Holmes shook his head. "Number, I believe him to be merely an unwitting participant in a far larger scheme. But there is something at play here, something beyond the reach of ordinary financial dealings." He snapped the ledger shut. "Come, Watson. It is time we paid a visit to Mr. Thornton's former residence. I believe we shall find there a more tangible clue to this mystery." Thornton's house stood in a narrow lane off Kensington High Street, its windows shuttered and its doorway thick with dust, as though time itself had abandoned it. The house had been empty since the old man's passing, and its air of neglect was only deepened by the biting wind that whistled through its eaves. Holmes knocked briskly upon the door, and after some moments it was answered by a hunched, elderly man with a lantern in hand. His eyes, rheumy but sharp, studied us with suspicion. "You'll be the first to come ask after Mr. Thornton in years," he said gruffly. "And what business have you with a dead man's house?" Holmes produced his card. "Sherlock Holmes, consulting detective. This is my associate, Dr. Watson. We are investigating a matter related to Mr. Thornton's estate and require access to his study." The caretaker snorted. "If it's money you're after, you'll be disappointed. The old man took his secrets with him to the grave." He stepped aside, allowing us entry. "But if you want to see the place where he spent most of his days, you'll find it just as he left it." He led us through a dim corridor, the air thick with the scent of old parchment and neglect. The study was a small, cluttered room, lined with dusty shelves that bowed under the weight of countless volumes. A heavy wooden desk sat at its center, its surface covered in scattered papers and ink bottles long dried. Holmes moved forward with swift purpose, his gaze scanning the room. "The old man was obsessed with his coins," the caretaker muttered. "Had them locked away in a case, always studying them like they held some great secret. People said he was mixed up in things he ought not to be." Holmes paused. "Mixed up in what sort of things?" The caretaker hesitated, lowering his voice. They said he knew people, strange people, that he dealt in more than just gold and silver. But no one ever proved anything. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. Fascinating, he murmured. I suspect Mr. Thornton's true interests extended far beyond mere collection. He turned his attention to the desk, his fingers tracing its edges. Then, with a sudden flick of his wrist, he pressed upon one of the carved panels, and a small compartment sprang open. I peered inside. A single empty coin case lay within, its velvet lining worn with age. Upon its surface, an inscription was faintly etched. Holmes withdrew his lens and read aloud. Redibit ad dominum. I frowned. Latin? Holmes nodded. It will return to its master. He snapped the compartment shut, his expression triumphant. Watson, I do believe we have found the key to our mystery. Holmes's long, slender fingers traced the edges of the desk with a careful, practiced touch. His gaze, sharp and analytical, darted across its surface, pausing at the faintest irregularities in the woodwork. I had seen him in this state before, the absolute concentration of a mind that had already leapt ahead to a conclusion, its certainty waiting only for physical confirmation. Watson, he murmured, observe the inlay here, just beneath the second drawer. Do you perceive anything unusual? I bent down, following his indication. The carving is slightly raised, I noted. A minor imperfection in the craftsmanship, perhaps. Holmes smiled faintly. Or a deliberate device. With a swift movement, he pressed upon the irregularity. A soft click sounded, and the panel sprang open by a fraction of an inch. Holmes withdrew a penknife from his pocket, slipping its edge into the gap, and with a deft motion, he eased the concealed compartment fully open. We peered inside. The recess was shallow, containing only a small, velvet-lined coin case. It was empty. Holmes reached in and lifted the case with delicate precision. The material was worn, the corners frayed, suggesting frequent handling. Upon its surface, an inscription was barely visible, faded, yet unmistakable. He produced his lens and read aloud, Redibit ad dominum. Latin? I asked. He nodded. It will return to its master. A silence settled between us as we regarded the cryptic message. I felt a strange unease, as though we had uncovered something that was not meant to be disturbed. Holmes turned the case over, his fingers pressing against its lining. The absence of the coin is more telling than its presence, he said thoughtfully. It suggests that Thornton either parted with it voluntarily or that it was taken from him. The caretaker, who had remained near the door, gave a low chuckle. Aye, and that's not the only queer thing about the old man, he muttered. They said he was always talking to himself, whispering over those coins as if they'd whisper back. Holmes glanced up sharply. Did he ever speak of this particular coin? The caretaker shrugged. If he did, I never heard, but I know he was afraid of something. He hesitated, then added, and he wasn't the only one. There were men who came to see him, men with sharp eyes and quiet voices, not the kind you'd want to cross. Holmes closed the compartment with a decisive snap. Watson, he said, I believe this sovereign's history is far more intricate than we suspected. If Thornton was fearful, it was not without cause. And if this coin has indeed been returning to Harrow, then it is not by chance, but by design. I watched him pocket the case, already sensing the chase ahead. What do you propose as our next course of action? He straightened. We must understand the true significance of this coin. And for that, we require the expertise of a man who knows such matters intimately. There was an unmistakable gleam of excitement in his eyes as he turned toward the door. Come, Watson. We have an appointment to keep, with Professor Alfred Graves. Our cab rattled through the narrow streets of Bloomsbury, the morning fog curling around the gas lamps like ghostly fingers. Holmes had given our driver precise instructions, and before long we arrived at a modest yet respectable townhouse, home to Professor Alfred Graves, one of England's foremost numismatists. Professor Graves was a man of scholarly appearance, his hair prematurely silvered and his spectacles perched upon the bridge of a thin, aquiline nose. He greeted us with polite curiosity and ushered us into a study lined with glass cases containing coins of every era and origin. Holmes wasted no time. Producing the sovereign, he handed it to Graves, who accepted it with a murmured expression of interest. Adjusting his lens, he turned the coin over in his hands, running a fingertip along its ridged edge. "Unusual," he muttered. "Very unusual indeed." "In what manner?" Holmes prompted. Graves placed the coin beneath a magnifying glass. "The minting is genuine, undoubtedly an English sovereign of recent issue. However, these indentations along the rim are not part of any standard design. They are deliberate, too subtle for the untrained eye, yet unmistakable." "Are they markings of ownership?" I inquired. "In a sense." Graves looked up. "This is not merely currency, Dr. Watson. It is a token, one likely used within a specific, exclusive circle. Such pieces have been known to serve as identifiers among clandestine societies, a means by which members recognize one another." Holmes leaned forward. "And this particular token, do you recognize its origin?" Graves hesitated. "I cannot say with certainty, but I have seen similar markings before, in connection with less than reputable organizations." "Such as?" Holmes pressed. The professor sighed. "There have long been rumors of an old network, one that deals in secrets rather than gold. If this coin was theirs, then it was never meant to circulate beyond their control." Holmes's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Then we may assume that its return to Harrow was no accident." As we departed Professor Graves's residence, I could not help but express my growing unease. The morning's revelations had only deepened the enigma, and I found myself troubled by the implications. "Holmes," I said at last, "are you truly suggesting that this coin is being deliberately tracked, that some invisible hand ensures it finds its way back to Harrow?" Holmes, hands clasped behind his back, strode ahead with his usual air of certainty. "I suggest, Watson, that human agency is at play. A sovereign does not possess the ability to return to its owner of its own volition." "But the sheer improbability of it," I protested. "What mechanism could possibly explain such a thing? Harrow has parted with this coin in numerous ways, and yet it finds him again. Surely," Holmes interrupted, "there is a logical explanation. You assume the manner of its return is beyond reason because you lack sufficient data. That, my dear fellow, is precisely what we must acquire." I exhaled in frustration. "And what do you make of Graves's suggestion? That the sovereign is linked to some secret society?" Holmes nodded. "It would account for its significance. If this coin was never intended to leave a certain circle, then its reappearance in Harrow's possession may be no more than the correction of an error." I frowned. "Then you mean to say that whoever is responsible will continue until it is reclaimed?" Holmes smiled. "Precisely. And that, Watson, gives us our next course of action. If the rightful owners seek to recover it, they will come again, and this time we shall be ready for them." Holmes sat in deep contemplation at Baker Street, his long fingers pressed together beneath his chin, his gaze fixed upon some unseen point in the distance. The discoveries of the day had provided a crucial thread in our investigation, but I sensed that his mind had already pushed beyond what had been revealed. "Watson," he said at last, "we must consider not only the origin of this coin, but also its consequences. What if I were to tell you that Mr. Harrow is not the first man to receive this sovereign, nor perhaps the first to fear it?" I looked up from my notes. "You suspect others have possessed it before him?" "More than suspect," Holmes replied. "I have already begun to trace its path." He reached for a bundle of newspaper clippings upon the table. "I took the liberty of requesting records concerning Elias Thornton's associates. It appears that several individuals known to him have met unfortunate ends." He passed me the first article. The headline read, "City financier found dead in private chambers. Suspected heart failure." "George Harville," Holmes said. "A businessman who frequently met with Thornton. He was found dead in his lodgings, clutching an object so tightly in his hand that the police had to force his fingers open." "The sovereign?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "The very same. It was recorded among his effects but never retrieved by family or acquaintances. From there, it disappears for some months before resurfacing in the hands of a solicitor named Arthur Longmere." He handed me another clipping. "Tragic suicide of Kensington lawyer. Mysterious circumstances surround death." "Longmere," Holmes continued, "was said to have been acting as Thornton's legal advisor. Shortly before his death, he confided in a colleague that he had come into possession of something best left undisturbed." A chill passed over me. "And now it is in Harrow's hands." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Indeed, and the question that follows is whether the sovereign's return is the product of deliberate design, or whether it signals that Mr. Harrow too is in grave danger." It was scarcely past midday when a telegram arrived from Harrow, urgent and brief. "Sovereign missing. No sign of forced entry. Found it in my pocket this morning. Please advise." Holmes read it twice, then handed it to me. "There, Watson. The pattern continues." I frowned. But how can it be? He had locked it away, had he not? Holmes rose from his chair. "Precisely why we must go to him at once. If I am not mistaken, the true test of this mystery is about to unfold." We made our way swiftly to Lombard Street, where Harrow greeted us with visible agitation. He wasted no time in leading us to his office, where the small safe stood open and empty. "I placed the coin inside last night," he said, his voice tight with controlled fear. "The lock was intact this morning, yet when I checked, it was gone." "And then?" Holmes prompted. Harrow hesitated. I reached into my pocket, and there it was. There was a silence in the room. For once, I found myself at a loss. Holmes, however, appeared undisturbed. He turned to Harrow with a measured gaze. "And you are certain, Mr. Harrow, that no one but yourself had access to this room?" "Absolutely." Holmes nodded. "Then we may be certain of two things. First, that the sovereign did not move by its own volition, and second, that the person responsible wanted you to believe otherwise." A shudder passed through Harrow. "Then I am being watched?" "Without question," Holmes replied. "And if my deductions are correct, your watcher will not stop until they have taken what they seek." He turned to me with a gleam of certainty in his eyes. "Come, Watson. It is time we laid our own trap." It was well past midnight when Holmes and I arrived at Harrow's residence, a tall and narrow house in Kensington, its windows darkened but for the faintest glow from the study. Harrow himself greeted us at the door, his face pale and anxious. "I have done as you instructed, Mr. Holmes," he whispered. "The coin is locked away in my desk." Holmes nodded. "And you are certain that your staff is unaware of our presence?" "They have all retired for the night," Harrow assured him. "Good, then let us take our positions." We concealed ourselves in the shadows of the study, Holmes taking a chair near the fireplace, while I positioned myself behind a heavy curtain. Harrow, as instructed, remained at his desk, feigning work. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the distant chime of a clock. Then, at last, came the faintest creak of a floorboard from the hallway. Holmes's grip on his cane tightened. The door handle turned ever so slowly, and in the dim light, we saw the silhouette of a figure slipping inside. The intruder moved with practiced stealth, heading straight for the desk. Holmes struck a match. The sudden flare of light startled the man, who whirled about. But before he could react, Holmes was upon him, his strong hands locking around the intruder's wrist. "Watson, the door!" Holmes called. I lunged forward and secured the exit, blocking any hope of escape. Caught in the dim glow of the study lamp, our intruder was revealed, a wiry, sharp-featured man in his middle years, his dark eyes flashing with both fury and desperation. Holmes studied him for only a moment before speaking. "Good evening, Mr. Percy Blythe," he said. "I believe you were looking for something." Percy Blythe was no ordinary housebreaker. Though dressed in dark, nondescript attire, there was something about his bearing that suggested familiarity with London's underworld. He made no attempt to struggle, though his eyes darted between us, measuring his chances. Holmes tightened his grip on the man's wrist. "It is useless, Blythe. You are caught." Blythe sneered. "I don't know what you're talking about." Holmes shook his head. "Come now, let us not waste time with falsehoods. You entered this house with a singular purpose. The coin, Blythe. Where is it?" Blythe's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't know anything about a coin." Holmes reached into Blythe's coat pocket and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it, revealing the unmistakable gleam of the sovereign. "Well," Holmes murmured, "it appears that the coin, much like its previous owners, has once again changed hands. The only question that remains, Blythe, is for whom were you working?" Blythe said nothing, but there was something in his expression, an uneasy flicker, a shadow of fear, that told me he would not hold his silence for long. Holmes seated himself across from Blythe, his gaze unwavering. "You are a professional, Blythe, a man who works for hire, not for sentiment. That means you were sent." Blythe remained silent, his jaw clenched. Holmes leaned forward. "And yet, there is something different about this job, is there not? A man like you does not frighten easily. Yet I see fear in your eyes." Blythe exhaled sharply. "You don't know what you're meddling with." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Then enlighten me." Blythe hesitated. Then, in a low voice, he muttered, "They will stop at nothing to take it back." Holmes exchanged a glance with me before returning his gaze to Blythe. "Who are they?" The man shook his head. "It's not my place to say." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Then allow me to speculate. The coin is not merely valuable. It is a marker, a key of sorts, belonging to an organization that does not take kindly to lost property. You were hired to retrieve it, but now that you've failed, you fear the consequences." Blythe's silence was all the confirmation we needed. Holmes rose. "Watson, I believe our next step is clear. If this sovereign truly belongs to such dangerous hands, then we must meet them before they come for it themselves." The morning following our encounter with Percy Blythe, Holmes set about putting his plan into motion with his usual brisk efficiency. He sat at the writing desk, pen in hand, drafting a series of letters with an energy that betrayed his satisfaction. "Harrow will do precisely as I instruct," he remarked without looking up. "He will inform his associates, and, by extension, those who watch him, that he intends to part with the sovereign through an auction." I leaned forward. "You intend to draw them into the open?" Holmes smiled. "Precisely. There is no better way to expose a shadow than to tempt it into the light. These men, whoever they may be, desire the coin above all else. If they believe it is slipping beyond their grasp, they will act." He folded the final letter and summoned a boy from the street to deliver it. Then, turning to me, he continued, "The venue will be Blakesley's, the private auction house in Pall Mall. A discreet institution, one that deals in rare and peculiar items. Our adversaries will assume that the sovereign is to be sold there, and they will make their move." I frowned. "But surely, Holmes, if the auction is real, there is a chance we might lose control of the situation." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "The auction, my dear Watson, is an illusion. The coin will never leave our possession, but the men who seek it will believe otherwise, and once they show themselves, we shall finally see the hand that guides them." As the letters were dispatched, Holmes stood, stretching his limbs with a satisfied air. "Now, Watson, we wait. Tonight, we shall witness our adversaries as they gather. I rather think it will be an instructive evening." Blakesley's was one of those discreet establishments known only to a select few in London's upper circles. Nestled between a jeweller's and a tailor's on Pall Mall, it was neither ostentatious nor unassuming, a place where fortunes changed hands in hushed tones. Holmes and I arrived early, securing seats near the back, where we could observe without drawing undue attention. Harrow, following Holmes's instructions, sat at the front, feigning indifference, but casting nervous glances about the room. Before him lay a small velvet pouch, within which the counterfeit coin rested, a perfect replica crafted that very afternoon by an expert, recommended by Holmes. The room filled gradually, a curious mixture of gentlemen and collectors, all of whom seemed to know one another by reputation, if not by name. But it was one man in particular who caught Holmes' attention. Seated near the far end of the hall was a tall, sallow-faced gentleman with deep-set eyes and a manner of cool detachment. He neither spoke nor bid, but watched the proceedings with an intensity that belied his calm exterior. Holmes murmured under his breath, "There is our man, Watson." I studied him more closely. His dress was immaculate, but there was something foreign in his bearing, a slight stiffness that suggested he was not wholly accustomed to English society. "Who is he?" I whispered. Holmes did not answer at once. His eyes remained fixed on the man as the auctioneer called the first item. "That," he said at last, "is the spider at the centre of the web, and before this night is over, he shall know that we are watching him as closely as he watches the coin." The auction proceeded in its usual manner, with the bidding moving smoothly from one item to the next. Yet, despite the outward normalcy, I could feel the rising tension in the room. The foreign gentleman, whom Holmes had identified as our man of interest, remained silent and still, his keen eyes fixed unwaveringly upon Harrow. The moment arrived. The auctioneer cleared his throat and announced the next lot, a rare and unusual sovereign, formerly in the possession of a private collector. Holmes's deception was now fully in play. The false coin lay within its velvet case upon the podium, an unremarkable object to most, but to the right eyes it was a prize beyond value. The auctioneer's voice rang out, "Shall we begin at 10 guineas? A gentleman in the front row raised his hand. 10. 15, came another bid. The foreign gentleman had remained impassive until now, but as the price climbed, I saw his fingers tighten upon the armrest of his chair. His breathing had quickened. Holmes, beside me, leaned forward slightly, watching him with an expression of pure satisfaction. 50 guineas, came a call from across the room. That was when it happened. The gentleman, abandoning all caution, sprang to his feet. In one swift motion, he pushed aside his chair and strode towards the auctioneer's stand. "This auction is a farce," he declared, his accent thick and unmistakably European. "This coin is not for sale. It belongs to me." Gasps rippled through the audience. The auctioneer, taken aback, faltered in his response. Harrow recoiled in alarm, and Holmes alone remained utterly composed, as though this was precisely the moment he had anticipated. "Watson," he murmured, rising from his chair, "I believe it is time to conclude this performance." The room erupted into a commotion as the foreign gentleman attempted to seize the coin, his hand outstretched toward the auctioneer's stand. But before he could grasp it, Holmes was upon him. "Sit down, Mr. Martell," he said sharply, grasping the man's wrist with unexpected strength. "The performance is over." The man stiffened at the name. His eyes darted toward Holmes, then back to the coin, his expression shifting from anger to something akin to resignation. "I do not know what you mean," he said coldly, though his voice lacked conviction. Holmes smiled. "Oh, I rather think you do. You are Victor Martell, formerly associated with Elias Thornton. You have pursued this sovereign across London, sending hired men to recover it by force when subtlety failed you. And yet, for all your efforts, it has eluded you, until now." Martell's lips curled in a sneer. "You speak as though you know me." Holmes gave a slight nod. "I know enough. You were once a trusted associate of Thornton, privy to his dealings, his acquisitions. You knew the value of the coin he possessed, not in gold, but in what it represented. Martel's jaw tightened. Thornton was a fool. He sought to keep what was not his. Ah, Holmes murmured, his eyes gleaming. Then we begin to see the truth. This sovereign was never truly Thornton's, was it? He merely held it as a safeguard. And when he died, it passed into unintended hands, first to Harville, then to Longmere, and finally to Harrow. The coin was never lost, Martel. It was being retrieved. Martel's face darkened. You know nothing. Holmes tilted his head. Do I not? The coin is a marker, is it not? A key of sorts, tied to a greater secret, one that your associates would see returned to its rightful place. Martel said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. Holmes released his grip and gestured towards Lestrade, who had entered the room unnoticed amidst the commotion. Inspector, Holmes said, I believe you will find Mr. Martel of great interest. He has much to explain. Martel exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping in reluctant defeat. Holmes turned to me, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. Well, Watson, he said, I believe we now hold every piece of the puzzle. Martel's eyes darted about the room, seeking some means of escape, but finding none. With Lestrade's men blocking the exits and Holmes standing before him, calm yet unrelenting, he knew the game was over. His shoulders slumped. You do not understand what you are meddling with, he muttered. Holmes inclined his head. Then enlighten us. Martel hesitated before exhaling sharply. The sovereign was never meant to be spent. It was a marker, a token of identification among a select few. Thornton was one of us, once. When he broke from the society, he took the coin with him, knowing that so long as it remained in his possession, he could never be truly free. And yet, it passed through many hands after his death, Holmes observed. Martel nodded grimly. Because it was meant to return. The moment it left Thornton's grasp, the society began to track it. We knew it would surface again, and when it did, we would reclaim it. Holmes steepled his fingers. And yet, your agents failed, multiple times. Martel's lips curled into a sneer. You think you've won, Mr. Holmes? You think removing me from this room will put an end to it? You have no idea who you are dealing with. Holmes regarded him with quiet amusement. On the contrary, I believe I understand perfectly. And that is why your efforts have failed, Martel. Because for all your secrecy, your society is bound by rules. Rules that I have now seen clearly. Martel's expression darkened. And what do you plan to do with your knowledge, Mr. Holmes? Holmes smiled faintly. Why, use it, of course. Holmes turned to me, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. Watson, the mystery is no mystery at all. It is merely a question of organization. I frowned. Organization? Precisely. The coin has not returned to Harrow by supernatural means. It has been placed back into his hands, deliberately. A network of agents, scattered throughout London, has been watching every transaction, every exchange. At the first opportunity, they have ensured that the sovereign finds its way home. Harrow, who had been listening in stunned silence, finally spoke. But why? What purpose does this serve? Holmes gestured toward the sovereign. It is not the coin itself that matters, Mr. Harrow. It is what it represents. The men who seek it are not after gold. They are after something far greater. Martel scoffed. You're clever, Holmes. But even you have yet to see the full picture. Holmes studied him for a moment. Then perhaps you will do us the courtesy of completing it. Martel's smirk faded, and for the first time, there was something akin to resignation in his eyes. The coin, he said at last, is a key. Holmes nodded. A key to what? A location. A vault hidden abroad, untouched for decades, containing a fortune that was never meant to fall into unworthy hands. Harrow's face paled. And Thornton, he had access to this? He was a guardian, Martell admitted. One of many. When he died, the coin should have passed to its rightful successor. Instead, it fell into the hands of men who had no understanding of its significance. He turned to Holmes. Now tell me, detective, what will you do with it? Holmes glanced at the sovereign, then at Lestrade. I believe, gentlemen, that we shall see to it that this coin finds its way to the right hands, once and for all. Martell let out a quiet laugh. Then I pray you choose wisely. Holmes smiled. Oh, I always do. Inspector Lestrade stepped forward, his usual air of skepticism replaced with grudging admiration. Well, Mr. Holmes, he said, snapping a pair of handcuffs onto Victor Martell's wrists, you've certainly given us a tidy case. A clandestine society, a hidden fortune, and a coin that refuses to stay lost. I'll wager even Scotland Yard could not have devised such a tale. Holmes inclined his head. It was never the coin itself, Lestrade, but the men who pursued it. Had Mr. Harrow known what he possessed, he might have spared himself considerable distress. Harrow, who had been listening in stunned silence, now found his voice. And what will become of Martell? Lestrade gestured toward the captive. With the evidence we've gathered, he'll face charges of conspiracy, theft, and attempted coercion. And as for his associates, we'll see to it that they're rounded up before the night is out. Martell, though defeated, retained a measure of his defiance. You may have stopped me, Holmes, he sneered, but the society is greater than one man. Do you truly believe that with my arrest, this ends? Holmes regarded him with cool amusement. On the contrary, I expect this is only the beginning. Your superiors will no doubt wish to recover their precious marker, and they will find, to their dismay, that it is now quite beyond their reach. Lestrade nodded toward one of his men. Take him away. As Martell was led from the room, Holmes turned to Harrow. I trust you will sleep easier now, Mr. Harrow. The sovereign will trouble you no longer. Harrow exhaled deeply. You have my deepest gratitude, Mr. Holmes, and yet I cannot help but wonder, what will become of the coin now? Holmes smiled. Ah, my dear Mr. Harrow, that is where the true mystery remains. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the sovereign, letting it rest in his palm for a moment before closing his fingers around it. Come, Watson. We have one last puzzle to solve. Back at Baker Street, Holmes wasted no time in setting to work. With his magnifying glass in one hand and a delicate blade in the other, he examined the sovereign with an intensity that I had come to recognize as the prelude to revelation. There is something hidden within this coin, Watson, he murmured, a secret that Martell and his associates have pursued for years. I leaned forward as he turned the coin in the lamplight. But we have examined it before, Holmes. There was no sign of forgery or alteration. Holmes smiled faintly. Then, my dear Watson, we must look closer. With a practiced motion, he applied the blade to the sovereign's edge, twisting it with precision. There was a faint click, and before my astonished eyes, the coin split in two, revealing a hollow compartment within. Inside lay a tiny slip of parchment, yellowed with age. Holmes extracted it carefully, unfolding it to reveal a series of symbols and coordinates. He studied them for a moment, his expression unreadable. Well, Watson, he said at last, it appears we have found the map to a very real fortune. I could only stare. And what now, Holmes? Holmes tapped the parchment thoughtfully. Now, my dear fellow, we decide who is truly worthy of this treasure. He turned the sovereign halves over in his palm before snapping them shut once more. Some mysteries, Watson, are better left unsolved, and some fortunes best left undiscovered. With that, he placed the coin into his desk drawer and closed it with finality. And so ended the mystery of the sovereign that refused to be lost. But to this day, I cannot say whether Holmes ever returned to that tiny slip of parchment, or whether, in some far-off place, a fortune remains hidden, waiting for the one who can decipher its secret. For the next 3 days, Holmes remained uncharacteristically occupied with official matters, vanishing for hours at a time, and returning only to retreat into his own thoughts. It was not until the morning of the 4th day that I found him seated at the breakfast table, a telegram in one hand and a faint look of satisfaction upon his face. "Well, Watson," he said, tossing the telegram toward me, "it appears that our little affair has reached its inevitable conclusion." I unfolded the paper and read the brief message. Treasure secured. No interference. Instructions followed. M. I looked up. The vault. Holmes nodded. Precisely as I deduced. The coordinates hidden within the sovereign led to a location in northern Spain, where Thornton's society had concealed a vast sum decades ago. The authorities, acting upon my suggestion, reached it before our adversaries. I set the telegram down. Then the society's efforts have been for nothing. Holmes smiled faintly. Not entirely. They succeeded in ensuring that the fortune remained out of unworthy hands, though not quite as they intended. The Spanish government, as the rightful authority over the land in question, will now see to its distribution. I rather doubt Martel's associates will be pleased I shook my head. And yet, had we not interfered, the fortune might have fallen into unknown hands, or worse, remained lost altogether. Precisely, Watson. Holmes sipped his tea. It was never a question of gold or silver, but of control. The sovereign was but a key, an object of passage. Without it, no man could claim what lay hidden. There was a moment of silence before I spoke again. And what of Harrow? I imagine he will be relieved to be free of it. Holmes's lips curved slightly. Ah, my dear Watson, that is where our story finds its final chapter. He rose, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing the sovereign once more. Mr. Harrow has made a decision regarding this most persistent of coins, and it is one I rather think you will approve of. Harrow received us in his banking office, his countenance notably lighter than when we had first made his acquaintance. Gone was the restless anxiety, replaced by a calm resignation. On his desk sat the sovereign, gleaming in the morning light. "I have given it much thought, Mr. Holmes," he said. "This coin has caused me no end of distress, yet I cannot deny its significance. It belongs not to me, nor to any single man, but to history itself." Holmes inclined his head. "A wise conclusion, Mr. Harrow." "I have arranged for its donation to the British Museum," Harrow continued. "There it will remain preserved, free from those who would seek to claim it for themselves. Let it be studied, examined, but never again pursued." Holmes smiled. "An appropriate fate for an object that has eluded so many." "You are quite certain?" Harrow exhaled. "More than certain, Mr. Holmes. I have no desire to tempt fate again." He reached for the coin, turning it over once in his palm before placing it into a small velvet-lined box. "And thus, the mystery of the returning sovereign comes to its end." Holmes took up his hat. "Indeed, Mr. Harrow, but let us hope it does not, in some peculiar fashion, find its way back to you once more." Harrow let out a nervous chuckle. "Heaven forbid." As we stepped onto the bustling streets of London once more, I turned to Holmes. "Do you believe the mystery is truly at an end?" Holmes gave a small, knowing smile. "Ah, Watson, some mysteries never truly end. They merely find new hands to perplex." With that, he hailed a cab, and together we vanished into the morning throng, leaving behind the coin that had refused to be lost and the legend it had written in its wake. As Holmes and I made our way through the familiar streets of London, I could not help but reflect upon the singular nature of the case we had just concluded. The morning fog clung to the city, muffling the sounds of passing cabs and distant footfalls, as though the world itself conspired to grant us a moment of quiet contemplation. "Holmes," I said at last, "of all the cases we have encountered, this one stands among the most peculiar. A sovereign that refused to be lost, a secret society, and a fortune hidden for decades. One might almost be tempted to call it supernatural. Holmes gave a low chuckle. You disappoint me, Watson. Surely you do not, after all these years, still cling to such notions? I shook my head. No, I suppose not. And yet, the manner in which the coin returned to Harrow, time and again, it does defy ordinary explanation. On the contrary, Holmes replied, it conforms to the most fundamental principles of human action. What appears inexplicable is merely a series of calculated movements, invisible only to those who fail to observe them. I sighed. And yet, there was something unnerving about the way it all unfolded. Thornton's fear, the deaths that followed, the unseen hands ensuring that no man could keep what was never meant to be his. Holmes gave a small smile. Ah, Watson, you see mystery where I see inevitability. The true lesson here is not that the sovereign returned, it is that it was never truly lost to begin with. We continued in silence for a few paces, the city stirring around us. And then at last, Holmes spoke again. You see, Watson, he said, lighting his pipe as we neared Baker Street, even in the most extraordinary of cases, the explanation is always rooted in logic. I gave a wry smile. You would reduce all things to a matter of cause and effect. Because all things are a matter of cause and effect, he replied. This sovereign was no mystical object. It was an instrument, wielded with purpose by those who sought to control it. The only true mystery was whether we would see the pattern before it was too late. I laughed. And yet, there are moments when even you must admit that some things remain unknowable. Holmes exhaled a thin plume of smoke. Unknowable to some, perhaps, but never beyond reason. He quickened his pace as our door came into view. Now, Watson, let us put this matter behind us. I have been informed of a most singular incident in Surrey, a case which I believe will occupy our minds for the next few days. And with that, he vanished into 221B, his mind already engaged with the next mystery that awaited us. As we stepped into 221B Baker Street, Holmes removed his coat with his usual air of detachment, settling into his chair with an expression of quiet amusement. I, however, found myself still turning the case over in my mind. You know, Holmes, I mused, this entire affair has left me pondering a curious thought. For all the secrecy surrounding that sovereign, it seemed to have a mind of its own, always finding its way back to the hands of those who least desired it. Holmes gave a soft chuckle, tapping his pipe against the hearth. Not a mind of its own, Watson, merely the will of those who understood its importance. The greatest mysteries are not those which elude us, but those which hide in plain sight, waiting for the right observer to see them clearly. I nodded. Then, in the end, the coin was never truly lost? Holmes smiled faintly. Indeed. It was simply passing through the hands of men who were never meant to hold it. What do you think was Victor Martel's greatest mistake? Was it his failure to act with subtlety, or was there something else that sealed his fate? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed unraveling this mystery, subscribe for more gripping Sherlock Holmes cases and share this story with fellow lovers of detective fiction. After all, the world is full of mysteries. Who knows what puzzle we shall solve next?